As we learned in the last episode, Nero was finally free of his mother's influence. She had been stabbed to death over and over again by Nero's soldiers in her belly, the place from which her treacherous son had sprung. Nero was 19 and without parents, but he still had plenty of help to run Rome's empire. Nero's early years had been characterized by laws largely favorable to Rome's Senate, and it looked like Nero's reign was going to be a golden age for Rome's nobility. But the Roman senator Tacitus sees Agrippina's death as the beginning of the end. After murdering his own mother, Tacitus says of Nero, quote, "He approached the Capitol with pride as victor over a servile people, and gave his thanks, and then let himself loose on all the forms of depravity, which, though repressed with difficulty, respect for his mother, such as it was, had managed to check." That's Tacitus in his annals. Agrippina's death was the beginning of the slow and painful downfall of Nero's reign. That's our topic on this episode of the Pax Romana Podcast. Episode 19, Nero's Downward Spiral. Before we begin, I'd like to say thank you for bearing with me while I was away giving some talks in Europe. I was unable to put out a podcast episode this last week, but I hope that this week's episode will make up for it. It's an exciting one. Let's get right to it. For all of Agrippina's faults, her faults as a mother, quite frankly, her moral faults as well, her hovering presence over Nero, even if Nero hated it, had a moderating effect on the young emperor. Agrippina protected Nero from himself as much as from others, helping him discern the worthiness and the political usefulness of advisors, friends, associates, and others. But now Agrippina was gone, and there was a void, and into that space surged a sea of sycophants, men well versed in the use of flattery to gain power over the intellectually weak. And the attention and adulation that Nero received from these people no doubt disarmed the vulnerable emperor. Agrippina's protection of Nero had obviously been self-motivated. She wanted power, and her son was a means to that power. And I'm guessing that she gave Nero very little affection. She was such a calculating woman. And so now that Nero was receiving praise poured out by flatterers, it was probably music to his ears. And I think he came to believe his own hype. This would be a big problem for Nero. What kinds of things were being said about Nero? Well, we have the works of several poets from the age of Nero, including the eclogues of Calpurnius Siculus. An eclogue is a poem told through a dialogue, normally between shepherds. It's kind of a neat poetry form. So the first of Siculus's eclogues mentions Nero, says things like this, that he was, quote, a god who rules the nations, or that his reign was one in which, quote, the golden age springs to a second birth amid untroubled peace. This is language meant to compare Nero's reign with that of Augustus. But either this poem was written in that more peaceful period when Agrippina was still alive, or it's just an outright lie, because in the years that followed Agrippina's death, Nero's regime began a tumultuous downward spiral. Now, much of what happened was his own doing, like his increasing propensity to have people near him murdered. Some of it wasn't really his fault. There was a wave of rebellion in Great Britain that almost made him decide to abandon the province. It was that bad. And some of what happened may or may not have been his fault. We just don't know. So the Great Fire that burned unchecked for days in Rome and killed thousands, was Nero responsible for that? No one really knows for sure. So let's start with the first of these things, the people that were closest to Nero. Even before Agrippina died, Nero was growing tired of his wife Octavia. You'll remember that she was the daughter of the last emperor, Claudius. As Nero saw it, Octavia had just one job, to bear him a son. And she had failed to do this even after several years of marriage. Besides, Nero at this point had been with his mistress, who I introduced you to last time, Poppaea Sabina, for years. And so the year AD 62 brought a decisive event in the relationship between Nero, Octavia, and Nero's mistress, Poppaea. What happened? Poppaea became pregnant with Nero's child, and Nero apparently decided to make that child legitimate. And to do that, he needed to marry Poppaea. So he divorced Claudia, and then he publicly shamed her for a supposed barrenness and exiled her to an island. And later, Nero would have her executed on trumped-up charges of adultery. Nero doesn't have to do any of that. He could just simply have divorced her. But he had to do it with such vengeance. It gives us a little insight into who Nero is as a person. Just a few years later, after Nero divorced Octavia, the emperor married Poppaea. But Nero not only changed wives in AD 62. Unfortunately for Nero, his praetorian prefect died. This was his protector. This was a guy that his mother, Agrippina, had appointed for him. And this wasn't Nero's fault. The guy just died of natural causes, as far as anybody knows. The other person that leaves Nero's presence is Seneca, who had been Nero's advisor and tutor. And we don't know if Nero had Seneca removed. The other possibility is that Seneca realized that Nero, the man, was going to be different than Nero, the boy. And this golden age that the Senate had hoped for was really not going to come. And so Seneca opted for a strategic retreat and decided to disassociate with the emperor. And so in just 3 short years after Agrippina died in 59, he had lost the help of all of his main advisors. Agrippina, of course, was one of them, but then Seneca and his prefect, and then also his wife, too, was out of the picture. There's also a string of murders that begins in AD 62, and most of these people are distant relatives of Nero or are in some way connected to the family of Augustus. Presumably, these were potential rivals to Nero. Nero was getting increasingly nervous, which was causing him to become increasingly murderous. But the funny thing is, with Nero and with many Roman emperors, it's actually not the case that conspiracies precede their paranoia. It's usually that their paranoia causes them to murder people, which then gives birth to conspiracies so that the killing is stopped. And Nero's regime is just like this. The conspiracies that would later crop up against Nero are in no small part a product of the emperor's own paranoid behavior. So things were changing pretty rapidly for Nero. They were also changing outside of Rome as well. In Great Britain, there was a huge revolt that took the soldiers that were garrisoned there completely by surprise. In the decades since the invasion of Great Britain that occurred under Claudius, much of the island still, especially in the north, was unconquered. Southern Britain, however, had become a patchwork of Roman soldier camps, veteran colonies, and settlements of allied British clans and tribes. It was mostly pacified at this point, but one of those tribes lost their king when he died of natural causes. And his will was confusing because he left his kingdom to both his own people, but also the Romans as well. And the Romans took this as license to go ahead and go in there and just take what they wanted. And so when the Romans were confiscating this land, the now dead king's wife, Boudica, was beaten nearly to death, and their 2 daughters were raped. And these were allies. These were British allies of the Romans. If this was the civilization that the Romans had brought to the island, then many British tribes wanted no part of it. They would rather have their ancestral freedoms than live in a, quote, civilized society. So the Queen Boudica rallied her people to vengeance, and she gathered more than just her own people. She formed a coalition of Britons, more than 100,000 of them, and led them on a warpath through Roman-friendly cities and military garrisons in the southeast of Britain. They obliterated the 9th Roman Legion at the veteran colony of Camalodunum. This would be the modern-day city of Colchester in the southwest of England. Archaeological remains from that area suggest that the city was demolished. And by the time this group of rebels made their way to London, which they pillaged and burned, the death toll of both Romans and Britons was about 60 to 80,000. When Nero heard about the crisis in Great Britain, he considered just withdrawing his soldiers and abandoning the province. But his commanders on the island were ultimately able to quell the rebellion through a combination of tactical and technological advantages. The Romans had largely disarmed the populations in the south of Britain as a condition of rule, and the only reason the rebels were initially successful was surprise. It wasn't that they were actually better equipped or more organized than the Roman troops that were there. And so when the Roman armies finally recovered from the initial shock of the rebellion, they regained their discipline and they faced a British army nearly 10 to 20 times their number. It was huge. But the Romans held to their battlefield tactics. They peppered the enemy mass with projectiles before forming into wedges to penetrate, divide, and demoralize the gathered British rebels. And after some 80,000 of the Britons had been killed in the battle, the remainder finally fled. We don't know what happened to Boudica. Her fate is unknown, but she was never heard from again. And with that, southern Britain was pacified once again. But the calamities under Nero continued. AD 64 would see the most memorable of these, the Great Fire in Rome. Now, no one knows how this fire started, but despite Rome's reputation as a city of marble, much of it was still, in fact, a city of wood. Cheaply made apartment buildings tilted in the skies like tall firs, and Rome's urban underbrush was a jumble of lean-tos and hovels. Garbage littered the streets, and throughout this throng of kindling burned kitchen fires and oil lamps, baking ovens, and fire pits. A great fire was bound to happen, even if the city employed more than 1,000 fire watchers. It was just a matter of time. And July in the Mediterranean of that year must have been hot and dry. The summer of 64 was a real scorcher. Tacitus tells us that the great fire that blazed through Rome that year was so hot and so widespread that it could not be contained. And so for over a week in July, Rome burned. In the end, around half the city was damaged or outright destroyed. The loss of life was never calculated, but Tacitus gives some sense of what happened. Quote, "The blaze in its fury ran through the level portions of the city, then rose to the hills. While it again devastated every place below them, it outstripped all preventative measures. Added to this were the wailings of terror-stricken women, the feebleness of age, the helpless inexperience of childhood, the crowds who sought to save themselves from others, dragging out the infirm or waiting for them. While they looked behind them, they were intercepted by flames on their side or in their face. They crowded the streets or flung themselves down in the fields, while some who had lost their all, even their very daily bread, and others out of love for their kinsfolk whom they had been unable to rescue, perished, though escape was open to them." That's Tacitus in his Annals. Such an epic disaster naturally brings a need to understand what happened, and the need to understand what happened often shifts into questions of blame. Some sources believe that Nero ordered the fire set. This seems far-fetched to me. An accident in some shop or kitchen, especially considering just how susceptible Rome was to fire, that seems far more likely. But Romans, just like people today, are eager to find scapegoats. Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He was performing one of his works before an audience in the city of Antium. Now, this small detail about Nero performing outside of Rome may be the kernel of truth that grew into the emblematic but definitely false story of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Tacitus, who is one of our best sources for this episode, even says that Nero outlaid vast sums of money for repairs, and he made sacrifices to the gods on behalf of the city. But Nero's benevolence was simply not enough to shake people from their suspicions that Nero was somehow, in some way, responsible for the blaze. And so ultimately Nero needed to find a better scapegoat to deflect blame. And whether what happened next was his idea or someone else's, history would remember what happens next as the first chapter of a dark and depressing story of death and persecution. And I'll just let Tacitus do the talking about what happened next. Quote, "Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, for whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. An arrest was first made of all who pled guilty, Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burned to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the circus. Even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion. That's Tacitus in his Annals. Tacitus's account of what Nero did to the Christians is fascinating for a few reasons. First, it's one of the earliest non-Christian accounts of Christians. Christians were a small minority even when Tacitus wrote in the 1st century AD, less than 1/100th of the population of the empire. And Tacitus corroborates some of the history recorded in the New Testament. For example, that Jesus even existed and that he was crucified under the Judean governor Pontius Pilate. Tacitus is an independent source for those things. But for our story, we also see in this account the cruelty of Nero and the persecution that likely earned him his legacy in the church of being an antichrist. The tortures he devised for Christians, crucifixions, death by beast, live burnings, these even disgusted Tacitus. You should note that Tacitus shares common Roman prejudices against Christians. He calls them criminals who deserved extreme punishment. And yet, his point is that Nero debased himself by passing blame in this way. Nero wanted to seem both pious and just. He wanted to offer a living sacrifice to the gods and at the same time punish those who supposedly had brought destruction onto the city because of their strange religious practices. But this degree of savagery was interpreted as proof of Nero's debauched character. It wasn't really justice, and that's the point that Tacitus is making. But another reason that Nero seemed responsible for the fire and continued to be blamed even after he blamed the Christians is because of what he did next. Nero claimed much of the ruined real estate as his own and began construction on a mammoth golden palace that, had it been finished, would have rightly earned a place as the 8th wonder of the ancient world. It featured colonnades, fountains, gardens full of exotic animals, man-made lakes, and a colossal statue of Nero himself, nude of course, burnished in gold. These things and more were planned for Nero's golden palace. But a house of such splendor and size would never be completed, and much of it would later be destroyed, an apt emblem of the regime more generally. The downward spiral of Nero reaches its conclusion on the next episode of the Pax Romana Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana Podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana Podcast.